Clara didn't shed a single tear when her father traded her to the Apache chief. Not because she was brave, but because every tear she had inside her had long since dried up, suffocated by shame. There she stood, silent as the fire crackled between the two men. Her plain dress clung to her thin, bony frame, and her unkempt hair cast shadows over the crooked nose her stepmother always mocked. The men spoke of her like she was livestock, not a daughter. "She's strong," her father had said. "Doesn't complain. And I've got 5 more mouths to feed." Chief Taza, broad and silent, merely nodded in return, tossing a bundle of pelts and horseshoes to seal the deal. Clara had no understanding of Apache customs, but she knew one thing: she wasn't being stolen, she was being given away. Like a broken toy no one wanted. And the sting of that rejection sank deep into her heart. She had expected to be dragged away, perhaps beaten into obedience. But Taza did nothing. He simply handed her a blanket and gestured toward his horse with something like gentleness. The trail was long and Clara followed behind him, numb. Her mind spiraled, replaying memories of her father's disgust, of the townsfolk whispering behind her back that no man would ever want her, of little children giggling when she walked past with her slumped shoulders and pale, shallow skin. But as the mile stretched on, something shifted. Not fear exactly. Not hope either. But an acute awareness that she had finally left behind everyone who had told her she wasn't worth loving. When they reached a quiet clearing by a creek at sunset, Taza stopped. He dismounted, then looked at her, not through her, not past her, but directly at her. And the quiet in his gaze unnerved her more than any slap would have. Clara stood there, clutching the blanket, whispering, "Why didn't you say anything?" He didn't answer. Instead, he knelt and began building a fire. Not to control her, not to intimidate her, but simply to keep her warm. And something inside Clara, long frozen and coiled, shifted ever so slightly. For the first time in years she felt something other than the ache of rejection. Something like life, stirring faintly in her chest. Clara had expected rough hands, orders barked in a tongue she couldn't understand. But instead, she woke to the smell of roasted corn and the sound of water flowing just beyond their camp. As she sat up beneath the woolen blanket, she saw Taza already up, kneeling beside the creek, washing a strip of deer meat with slow, practiced movements. He looked up once, met her eyes and nodded. It wasn't commanding. It wasn't dismissing. It was simply an acknowledgement of her presence. And it felt so strange. Clara looked away, ashamed of how her heart reacted to the first hint of human decency she'd experienced in years. Back home, even her little brothers mimicked their father's sneers, calling her "crow-face" when their mother wasn't around. And now, here she was with a man her people called a savage, who hadn't raised his voice, hadn't raised his hand, only treated her like a person, like someone worth acknowledging. As they traveled deeper into the hills, Clara began to notice the way others looked at Taza when they passed through small Apache settlements. Some looked at him with respect. Others with fear. She realized Taza wasn't just any man. He was someone who carried weight, someone others followed. They spoke few words, mostly gestures and glances. But there was no cruelty in his silences, only patience. When Clara stumbled while crossing a stream, Taza caught her by the arm, steadying her firmly but gently. She blinked back a sob, not from pain but from the unfamiliar sensation of tenderness. How could this man, a stranger, care for her in a way no one ever had? That night, as they sat by the fire, Taza handed Clara a woven pouch filled with herbs and motioned for her to place it beneath her sleeping mat. Clara looked at him, confused. He simply murmured in broken English, "Dream good." That small kindness shattered something inside her. For the first time since her mother died, Clara allowed herself to cry. Not from rejection, but from the aching realization that this man, who owed her nothing, had treated her like a person with worth. What was she to him? Not a wife in the way her people meant it. Not a slave either. But as she lay beneath the stars, she wondered what kind of man would accept an unwanted girl as a gift and ask for nothing in return. Why, in his presence, did she feel more seen than in her entire life back home? The days grew warmer, the path rougher. But Clara's legs grew steadier. By the end of the first week, she no longer stumbled behind Taza. She walked beside him, sometimes close enough to catch the scent of pine smoke in his braids, other times falling just behind to watch how confidently he moved through the land that seemed to breathe with him. She didn't speak much, still unsure whether she was allowed to. But Taza had begun pointing out herbs, naming animals in his deep, measured voice, showing her which berries were safe to eat. One afternoon, as they passed a ridge of red stone, they encountered a rider. He was patchy, young, cocky, and armed with a bow slung low across his back. Clara didn't catch the full conversation, but the boy's tone was mocking. His eyes flicked to her with a smirk and then to Taza with a question that needed no translation. Clara's stomach twisted as the youth laughed, an ugly, sharp sound, and muttered something under his breath as he rode away. But Taza didn't flinch. He didn't speak. He simply stood there for a moment, jaw tight, and then resumed walking. That night, as they camped beneath a ledge, Clara finally asked, "Do they think I'm your punishment?" Taza looked at her for a long time before reaching into his satchel and pulling out a carved wooden comb. He placed it in her hands. "My mother made for wife," he said slowly, his accent thick but his meaning clear. "But she never come back. She die before I marry." Clara stared at the comb. Its smooth curve fit her palm like it had waited years to be held. She felt her throat tighten as something old and bitter inside her cracked open. "You could have refused me," she whispered, not looking up. Taza answered simply, "Your eyes were sad." He paused before adding, "I do not turn away sadness." That night, as Clara ran the comb through her tangled hair beneath the firelight, she didn't feel pretty, not yet. But she felt like, maybe, just maybe, being ugly had never been the real reason no one had stayed. Maybe no one had known how to see her until now. The first time Clara laughed, it startled them both. She had tripped on a root while gathering firewood and landed in a sprawl of pine needles. When she looked up and saw Taza stifling a rare crooked grin, the absurdity of it all, the fact that she, a bartered girl in Apache lands, had her hair full of twigs and was sitting beside him, this stoic warrior, made her laugh. A sharp, clear laugh that echoed through the trees. For a moment Taza just stared. And then, slowly he laughed too, not loud, not long, but real. And something shifted between them. Again. In the days that followed, the silence between them grew comfortable, almost companionable. Clara began to mimic his hand signs for water, fire, and food, finding pride in every new thing she learned. One evening, as she helped skin a rabbit he'd caught, he watched her hands. "You are not weak," he said. And though it wasn't a compliment in the usual way, it struck her deeper than any flattery ever had. But peace is fragile in a world built on pain. And it was broken the next day when they reached a small Apache village nestled in a canyon bend. Women stared, some whispering behind their shawls. An elder man approached Taza with words clipped and harsh. Clara stood back, unsure, but she caught enough to know that the man didn't approve of her, that he didn't believe she belonged. Taza responded evenly, but when the man gestured directly at Clara and spat on the ground, she flinched. Her body folded inward out of old habit. She expected Taza to remain quiet as always. But instead, he stepped forward, jaw clenched, and spoke with such firm authority that even the elder stepped back. Clara didn't understand the words, but the effect was clear. Taza had claimed her, not as a burden but as someone worth defending. That night, as they camped on the edge of the village, Clara sat by the fire and whispered, "Why do you keep doing that? Standing up for me?" For a long time he said nothing. Then finally he murmured, "Nothing." He stirred the fire with a stick and added, "Just stirred the fire." Clara watched him, understanding. She saw now that they were both remnants of things others had discarded. But here, in the wild, their brokenness was beginning to fit together. They left the village at dawn, tension still clinging to Clara like the smoke from last night's fire. But Taza walked ahead, his stride calm, his silence thoughtful. For the first time, Clara felt less like a follower and more like a partner. She carried her own supplies, set traps, and recognized the call of a red-tailed hawk overhead. And Taza, though still sparing with words, began to look at her differently. Not with pity, not with ownership, but with something that made her chest tighten with an unfamiliar hope. Yet that fragile thread was tested when they stumbled upon a bloodied settler's wagon near the base of a ridge. The wheels were splintered, one horse dead, the other limping with fear-matted flanks. Clara froze at the sight of the woman, blonde, pale, bruised, clinging to a bloodied rifle and whispering prayers. Taza approached cautiously, but the woman shrieked at the sight of him, raising the rifle with shaking hands and screaming, "Don't touch me, savage!" before collapsing in tears. Clara stepped forward, hands raised. Her voice was soft but steady. "He's not going to hurt you, I promise." But the woman's blue eyes locked on Clara with confusion and betrayal. "You're with him?" she spat, as if Clara had become the traitor. They helped her anyway. Taza tended to her wounds while Clara coaxed the horse into calm. By nightfall, the woman, whose name was Ruth, had stopped flinching at every movement. But her eyes still flicked to Taza with suspicion. That night, Clara sat apart, her heart churning with a shame she hadn't felt since leaving her father's house. A voice inside whispered that no matter how kind Taza was, no matter how much he'd done for Ruth, he'd always be a monster. And by being at his side, Clara would be seen as monstrous too. When she finally dared to ask Taza why he hadn't just left Ruth to die, he didn't look at her. He simply said, "Because she is alone. You remember what alone feels like." And Clara did remember. Too well. But for the first time she realized that walking beside a man like Taza meant choosing to live by a different kind of honor. Not the kind written in books or shouted in town squares, but the quiet kind that only reveals itself when no one else is watching. Clara woke the next morning to the sound of hushed voices. Ruth's strained whisper cut through the cool morning air. "You don't understand. And he's Apache. They kill people like us," she was saying. Clara stayed still, listening from behind the rocks where she'd gone to gather water. Her heart sank with every word. Finally Clara stepped into view, her voice firm despite the tremble beneath it. "He saved you," she said. "And he's done nothing but treat us both better than most white men ever have." Ruth flinched, caught but not backing down. "You weren't born out here," she hissed. "You don't know what they've done." Clara stared at her, a thousand memories flashing behind her eyes. Her father's disgust, her stepmother's cruelty, the way even little children laughed at her like she didn't belong anywhere. "No," Clara whispered. "I know what people do when they think someone's beneath them." Later, as they resumed their journey toward a nearby army outpost Ruth insisted existed, Clara walked a little further from Taza, guilt knotting in her chest. Not because she doubted him, but because she hated that part of her still feared how others would see them together. By midday they reached the hilltop Ruth had described, and below, like a scar across the prairie, lay the rough wooden fences and tents of a small cavalry outpost. Clara's stomach turned. She dreamed of places like this as a girl, places with order, roofs, and safety. But now they felt foreign. Ruth was greeted with immediate care. Soldiers rushed out with stretchers and questions. Their eyes scanned Clara's dress and dirt-smeared face before landing coldly on Taza. "Step back, savage," one barked. And when Clara opened her mouth to speak, another soldier grabbed her by the arm, muttering, "We'll get you home, miss. Don't worry, we'll handle him." Taza didn't resist. He didn't speak even as they forced him to the ground and bound his wrists. Clara shouted, "Stop it. He's with me." But no one listened. The world that had always ignored her had finally noticed. But only to put her back in the box she'd spent her life escaping. As they dragged Taza toward a holding tent, he met her gaze with something unbroken. Not fear. Not anger. But the same calm strength he'd shown since the night they met. And in that look Clara understood. If she didn't fight for him now, she'd be no better than the father who gave her away. Clara stormed into the captain's tent, her fists clenched, demanding, "Why is he being held?" The officer, a grizzled man with deep lines around his mouth and whiskey on his breath, just looked up slowly and said, "Because he's Apache, miss. And that's reason enough in these parts." She could feel the blood drain from her face as the room spun, not with fear but with fury. She slammed her hand on his desk, rattling a tin cup. "That man saved Ruth's life. He saved mine. And he's not a criminal." The captain didn't flinch. He just leaned back, coolly replying, "Maybe not. But we can't have him roaming free, scaring the womenfolk now, can we?" And that one sentence made something snap inside her. She marched out, her heart racing, found Ruth seated by the fire pit, bandaged and freshly clothed, sipping tea like she hadn't just watched the man who saved her be shackled. "Say something," Clara begged. But Ruth looked away, muttering, "It's better this way. You'll be safe now." Clara stared stunned. Then whispered, "You were never the one in danger.